Today we're busting some of the most annoying and potentially damaging myths around applying for Ecuadorian visas. Listo? Vamos! Welcome back to the channel, Jason from Yappatree here. One of the delights about choosing Ecuador as an expat is the relatively easy and cheap visa process. But that doesn't mean that you can't run into trouble along the way. And unfortunately, many expats do run into trouble when going through the visa process. So I'm exposing 5 of the most common Ecuador visa myths that I routinely see being thrown around. Hopefully, by watching this video to the end, you'll also avoid falling victim to them. I've been working with various visa facilitators and attorneys in Ecuador for multiple years now. We've also produced a lot of content on the topic of visas, which involves a lot of interviews and research. So overall, I do think that I have a very good view of the current practices, some good, some not so good, employed by the visa industry here. Now, I also happen to be a qualified lawyer and tend to put my legal hat on whenever this topic comes up. And it comes up a lot, as every expat needs to go through this process. But enough fluffery, let's get to the myths. Myth number 1, high price equals high quality. One of the biggest misconceptions is the belief that paying a hefty price for visa services or assistance guarantees a higher chance of success or faster processing. It's simply not true. The price tag does not determine the quality or efficiency of your visa application. Indeed, some of the most expensive visa providers sit at the very bottom of my list of agencies I'd recommend to friends and family looking for Ecuador visa assistance. What I tend to see happening a lot with Ecuadorian businesses is that they struggle when scaling their businesses. I'll walk you through a common scenario that I see. A visa provider obtains a following either through really good marketing or just generally providing a good service. Then they struggle to keep up with the quality standards due to this influx of new customers. And some visa providers are able to eventually cope with increased demand, but if your application is being processed during this growth period, then there is a chance that yours will fall through the cracks. The old adage, you get what you pay for, does not necessarily apply, and I do not suggest using price as a proxy for quality. So what should you look for instead of price? In my humble opinion, the only 2 things that matters when it comes to getting your visa processed are 1, firstly, the depth of knowledge of the current visa rules and the processes, and secondly, they need to have connections with the migration office that you're applying at. If you come to Ecuador and you think connections do not matter, you're absolutely crazy. They really do. And the best evidence to support both of these traits is to find out how many visas that provider has completed within the past few months. You really do want a visa factory here. You don't want an attorney that offers everything under the sun plus visas. You can even ask to contact some of their previous customers. If your provider balks at providing any referrals, then you pretty much have your answer. Myth 2, trusting random recommendations from Facebook groups. I've seen this end in disaster numerous times. However, it's actually a little bit more complex than it seems. You see, the first point you need to know is that Ecuador has very strong defamation laws. Post anything negative or even constructive about a business in Ecuador, and you should not be surprised if you receive a nasty letter from their attorney with all sorts of legal threats. Visas providers have sent these disgruntled letters to ex-customers in the past. The second point is that visas are generally a service that expats have exactly one experience with, and that is with the visa provider that they used, and this is the one that they obviously recommend. And they've potentially also become friends with this person or may even be receiving compensation for their recommendations. Now, put these 2 together and you end up with a scenario where the recommendations are only positive and made with a sample size of exactly 1. So whilst it may be somewhat helpful to hear about a random person's positive experience with a visa provider, you'll never hear from customers that did not have a good experience. And obviously, if someone has only used one provider and that they claim that they are the best, take that with a grain of salt, as they clearly have no comparison. So how do you know who to trust for visa recommendation? The unfortunate thing is, you don't. I wish I had an answer for you, and I truly despise the defamation laws here, and it's one of the most frustrating things that I'm still coming to grips with about living in Ecuador, even after all these years. Myth 3, rules are rules, so it doesn't matter which visa office I apply at. This one took me a while to come to grips with as well, because coming from a legal background, it is just really hard for me to understand why some migration officers apply different rules than others. After all, they should all be interpreting the laws in the same way, right? Actually, no, not all the time. And for us Cuenca folk, this really matters as the closest migration office to us is in Azogues, and it tends to be the most difficult one to work with. Perhaps the best example of this was when they interpreted a rule change in 2022. You see, the Ecuadorian government updated some visa rules relating to obtaining permanent residency. Most migration offices in Ecuador allowed you to spend up to 90 days outside of Ecuador during this 2-year temporary residency period and still be eligible for permanent residency. But the Azogues office took a contrarian view. If you spent just 1 day outside of Ecuador, they would deny you permanent residency. This rule was eventually challenged by some expats, and the expats did win. But who wants to go through that hassle? No gracias. Now, this is just one example, but there are many other instances that lead me to recommend using other migration offices where possible. Myth 4. My criminal history will prevent my application from being accepted. Let's be clear, like most countries, Ecuador does have a background check requirement that is aimed at keeping out the bad apples. And being completely honest, I'm glad they aren't letting in people with histories of violent or sexual crimes. Nobody wants these people in their backyard. But that doesn't mean that just because you got caught smoking some reefer at Woodstock, that you'll automatically be denied an Ecuadorian residency visa. There is a fair amount of subjectivity afforded to the migration officer that is processing your visa. They generally look at the type of conviction, the gravity of conviction, and how long ago the offense took place. In particular, any offense with a violent or sexual element will be heavily scrutinized, as may offenses that occurred within the last, say, 10 years. Now, do be prepared to be interviewed by your immigration officer if your background check does include some convictions. But I have seen many applications be approved that did include background checks that were not squeaky clean. Myth 5. I can stay 1 year in Ecuador without residency. There is a lot of outdated visa information out there, and one example of this is the special tourist visa, which was a great solution that effectively allowed you to stay 1 entire year in Ecuador with ease. I personally obtained this visa when it was available a few years ago, and it was great. However, it is no longer available and there is no replacement. There have been various rumors floating around there, but nothing has eventuated. So at the moment, you can currently stay in Ecuador for 6 months each year very easily. Residents from most countries can get their first 90 days upon arrival and then extend for another 90 days once you're here. We do have an article about this, which we'll link to as well. But after these 180 days, you'll need to look at obtaining a temporary residency visa if you want to spend more time in Ecuador. And that's a wrap, Yappa family. We have busted some common myths surrounding Ecuadorian visas that might have been holding you back. Remember, always seek accurate, up-to-date information from reliable sources, and if needed, reach out to experienced professionals for guidance. If you do want my recommendations for visa providers or general visa guidance, feel free to reach out to me, jason@yappatree.com. Of course, if you're in the market in Cuenca looking to rent or buy a property, more than welcome to send me an email or check out our current listings at yappatree.com. And whilst you're tapping away on your keyboard, feel free to like this video, as that does help our message reach more people. I do really appreciate you watching this video, and I hope that you're much better positioned to apply for your Ecuadorian visa. Until next time, take care, and remember, don't forget your yappa.